And with that, we'll go ahead and get started with tonight's discussion. What we're talking about here, folks, is the year 1775. This is fully 7 months before the Declaration of Independence was signed. The Revolutionary War did not start with the Declaration of Independence. It was well on its way before that document was signed. In March of 1775, the shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. In June of 1775, the British attacked Bunker Hill. They inflicted 400 casualties on the Patriot forces, and the British took Bunker Hill. The British suffered 1,000 casualties, and they ceased offensive action in Boston as a result of that. And Boston was under an 11-month siege until the Patriot forces brought cannons in over Dorchester Heights, threatened the British, and the British skedaddled. They sailed away from Boston. But during that time, there was quite a bit of activity in the backcountry of South Carolina as well, particularly in the 96th District, which Lawrence County was part of the 96th District during that time. So I mentioned to you that June of 1775 was Bunker Hill. In July of 1775 was the first offensive action in the province at that time of, or I guess it was really colony at that time, of South Carolina. This is the first offensive action south of New England. Now, throughout this series of lectures that I'm giving, you're going to hear me using a lot of superlatives. The first, the biggest, the most horrific. It all happened here, folks. Right where we are, within 50 miles of where we are, there were 112 Revolutionary War events. This was the center of activity, the center of action, more so than any place in America. So, don't fault me for using superlatives, grand superlatives, because it's true. It really is. And this is Lawrence County heritage. This is something that every one of you in this room should be proud of. So, Fort Charlotte was a fort on the Savannah River. There were a series of forts on the Savannah River built in the First Cherokee War, 1758, 1761, all up and down the Savannah. The forts on the Savannah were to guard against attacks from the Creek Indians, which were down in Georgia. In addition to that, there were forts all along the Indian boundary line. Greenville County was Cherokee territory. An entire series of forts that the settlers built in the First Cherokee War that were carried over and also used in the Second Cherokee War, which is 1776, which is next month's lecture. But there was quite a bit of turmoil in the backcountry, and Fort Charlotte was a granite fort. It was built out of cut granite, again on the banks of the Savannah. Currently, it is under Lake Thurman, but it was probably a pretty grand fort when it was constructed, but it deteriorated rapidly. And when the Patriot forces under James Mason approached the fort, can we turn off our cell phones, please? So when James Mason approached the fort, the commander there just surrendered. He was there with his wife and children. He had a few old men guarding the fort. The colonial forces, or the royal forces, had consolidated their arms at Fort Charlotte. There were 18 cannons there, lots of shot and powder. In describing these 18 cannons, I have a feeling that they were just the little bitty swivel guns that were so effective. They were naval guns. They only had a 1-inch bore. but you did not want to attack anybody pointing a swivel gun at you, because that thing was like a shotgun blast, and they were effective defensive weapons. The leader at that time, the colonel in charge, was James Mason. Now, there were 3 individuals who wanted to be the colonel during that time, and one of them was Moses Kirkland. And so many of these loyalties that were established early on had to do more so with personal animosities than they did with patriotism or loyalty or anything else. So Moses Kirkland assisted James Mason in the confrontation at Fort Charlotte as a patriot. But shortly thereafter, he switched his loyalties because he didn't like James Mason. And there was so much of that was going on. A lot of what I'm mentioning today, and I want y'all to know these characters and individuals that are involved. And many of the names that I give today are names that you are going to be hearing throughout the entire series of Revolutionary War events. And Moses Kirkland was an influential individual. Now, James Mason, I've tried to follow his career, and it kind of ends when he took Fort Charlotte. And he wasn't very active after that. He was replaced as the colonel of the 3rd South Carolina Rangers by a fellow named William Thompson, William Danger Thompson. And he was quite a character. And he was very influential early on in Revolutionary War activities. Well, in August of 1775, there was a delegation from Charleston, a Patriot delegation, William, Drayton, Tennant, and Hart. Drayton, Tennant, and Hart came through the backcountry trying to have folks sign the Oath of Association. This was the Patriot call to arms, if you will. They wanted to sign an association oath signifying that all of these other colonies were going to unify together in opposition to the rule of England. And they went from plantation to plantation to plantation, and that was where the center of civilizations were in the backcountry. Half the places they went to, they were well received with open arms, and everybody signed the Oath of Association. The other half of places where they went, they were spurned. Well, what this did was immediately let the folks know who was for the association, who was against. The Drayton, Tennant, and Hart mission was supposed to unify everybody into the Patriot cause, but it did not. It totally identified who was a patriot and who was a loyalist. And one thing I need to talk about now really is kind of the terms that were used back during that time. The Patriots, which is a term that I use because that's what everybody is most familiar with, it wasn't used back then. Nobody called themselves a patriot back then. What they called themselves were Whigs. They called themselves rebels, associators, and names like that. The term patriot did not become used until about 30 years after the war, when the northern papers were describing the events and so forth. Now, in George Washington's correspondence, he did occasionally use the term patriot, and that's the only reference I've seen to patriot from that particular time. Then those who were king's men, who supported the king, they were referred to as loyalists. But if you were a really bad loyalist, you were called a Tory. You were a Tory. So you'll hear me use the word Tories and loyalists, and also patriots as well. And Also, I'd like to describe sort of the events that were happening around the 96th district during that time, particularly as far as the other states are concerned. We had Georgia that we worked with quite closely. There were really only two cities in Georgia at that time, Savannah and Augusta. The leading patriot from Georgia was Elijah Clark, who worked closely with the patriots in the backcountry of South Carolina, and we worked closely with him. In North Carolina, we had Charles McDowell and Griffith Rutherfordton were the militia generals there that we worked with closely. Virginia was safe haven for the Patriot forces, Western Virginia in particular, and Eastern Tennessee. The Revolutionary War never touched Western Virginia, and it only touched Eastern Tennessee in the fact of Patrick Ferguson sending them a mean letter and those over mountain men coming over and showing Patrick Ferguson what's for. But this is what was happening in the surrounding area. Florida, believe it or not, had an influence on the backcountry of South Carolina. Florida was a dismal swamp. Nobody really wanted anything to do with Florida. Florida changed hands 4 times in 60 years. So it was Spanish all the way up to 1763. And I believe this has something to do with the 7 Years' War in England. I'm not sure, I hadn't double-checked this. But in 1763, every Spaniard was forced to leave and go to Havana, Cuba. And the English came in. Florida was divided into East Florida and West Florida. Capital of East Florida was St. Augustine. Capital of West Florida was Pensacola. The population of both of these two colonies was less than 1,000 in each one. Of course, now the Creek Indians were down there. And that was an influential band at that time. 1783, Florida went back to the Spaniards. And I think this may have something to do with the Treaty of Paris, but again, I hadn't double-checked that. And then in 1821, Florida became part of the United States. But in 60 years, Florida changed hands 4 times, and in the years during the Revolutionary War, 1763 to 1783, Florida was an English, I don't know if you'd call it a colony or not, but it was an English possession. And many of the backcountry patriots who were driven out of this area in the Snow Campaign, which we're getting ready to talk about, they left and went down to either East Florida or West Florida. Many of the Loyalists, after the war ended and they had to leave the country, many of them went down to Florida as well. So these are different influences that we had to concern ourselves with as far as the war here in the backcountry. So also of paramount importance to the backcountry was the relationship with the Cherokees. Now, if you don't get anything else from this series of lectures, I hope you realize that the Revolutionary War in South Carolina is divided into 2 periods. The first period, from 1775 to 1780, is the American period. And the American period primarily dealt with the relationship with the Cherokees. Charleston fell to the British forces on May the 12th, 1780. From that date onward was the British period. And it was a totally different war from the British period to the American period. So quite a bit of difference there. Cherokee relations were of paramount importance. The British forces had been supplying the Cherokees with shot and powder every year so that they could harvest deer skins. The Cherokee trade was lucrative. The Cherokees were trading deer skins and medicinal plants for hunting knives, pots and pans, and that sort of thing. And the European traders came out ahead on that deal every time, believe me. It was lucrative. So everybody wanted the Cherokees to be friends because their 6,000 warriors could create quite a bit of problems if they weren't friends. So the British government had been sending an annual shipment of shot and powder to the Cherokees so they could have their deer skin harvests. The Council of Safety in Charleston, which was the Patriot form of government, which ran the royal governor out of Charleston, they can go to a warship in Charleston Harbor. The Council of Safety decided, well, they wanted to placate the Cherokee, so they were going to send a shipment of shot and powder to the Cherokees. 2,000 pounds of lead and 1,000 pounds of powder in a wagon train that was going to follow the Cherokee Trail to Kiowee, which was the main trading post of the Cherokees in Oconee County. The Cherokee Trail passed through 96. 96 was the westernmost point of civilization at that time. And so the trail went through 96 up to Kiowee, where the trading would take place. Well, when Drayton, Tennant, and Hart were coming through the territory, there was one particular fellow who was the most obnoxious anti-patriot fellow that anybody could imagine. And his name was Robert Cunningham. And he's Patrick Cunningham's brother. We saw Patrick Cunningham's place. Patrick Cunningham was the wealthiest planter in the 96th district at that time. And Robert Cunningham was not far behind him. But Robert Cunningham was an avid loyalist. And he was raising a stink. And he raised such a stink that the Council of Safety arrested him and took him down to Charleston. And this is in like August of 1775. And we're going to hear a lot about Robert Cunningham throughout this series of lectures. There was a fellow in Augusta who was a very avid loyalist as well. And Augusta was divided. It was kind of a hotbed of loyalist sentiment as well as patriot sentiment as well. So the leading loyalist in Augusta was Thomas Brown. Sort of in opposition to him was a patriot named Leroy Hammond. And Leroy Hammond was an influential planter. He was a wealthy man. He fought in the French and Indian War, did very well there. And I'll tell you a little bit about the future of Leroy Hammond. He was a colonel in the Continental Forces. After the war, he was appointed the military governor of the Louisiana Territory. And after that, he was appointed military governor of the Missouri Territory. So he was, well thought of. After he retired from those two posts, which he served for a total of 20 years, he came back to South Carolina and served in the South Carolina House. So we're going to be hearing about Leroy Hammond. We're going to be hearing about Thomas Brown. And in August of 1775, a group of individuals, and Leroy Hammond may have been involved with this, a group of individuals calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. They corralled Thomas Brown. They hit him in the head with a stick. They fractured his skull. They tied him to a tree. They tortured him with fire. They burned 2 of his toes off. and he was called Burnfoot Brown ever since. They scalped him alive, and then they tarred and feathered him and ran him out of Augusta on a rail. So, you know, the Indians and the Loyalists and the Tories, they did some gruesome things to the American patriots, but that was a two-way street, folks. And you will be hearing about Thomas Brown quite a bit. He went down to Florida for most of the war, but he was also involved in some battles around here before he went down to Florida. So Robert Cunningham is captured, and he's down in Charleston. He's in a dungeon in Charleston. Robert's brother, Patrick, takes offense at this, and he gathers up a group of 200, some say 500 men. He's going to take them down to Charleston and rescue his brother. Well, he had no chance of rescuing his brother in Charleston. But he started on the Cherokee path, and he went through 96, and 18 miles below 96, at a place called Mine Creek, he comes across that wagon train of shot and powder that's meant for the Cherokees. So since Patrick Cunningham realizes that he can't save his brother, he's going to do the next best thing, and he captures the wagon train. He's got 200 men, the wagon train's guarded by 25 men. So he takes the shot and the powder to the edge of the civilization, which is the most settled place in the backcountry, which happens to be 96, which has a total of 12 houses. That's what a thriving metropolis it was. But 96 did have the grandest structure in the backcountry. 96 was established as a seat of justice back in about 1769, and they had a 3-story building there made of brick. And these folks from the backcountry, they would go to 96 just to stand there and look at it. It was the jail. That was the finest structure in the backcountry. So Patrick Cunningham goes to 96. Well, the Patriot forces, and at this time the leader of the Patriot forces was Colonel Andrew Williamson, who was from the Long Canes plantation. He was an Indian fighter. He gathers up a group of 450 men to oppose Patrick Cunningham's 200 men. Well, the Loyalists are organizing at the same time that General Williamson is organizing, and they raise a force of 1,400 to 1,900 men to surround Andrew Williamson, who's in 96. So all of a sudden, Andrew Williamson is faced with triple his numbers surrounding him. And he creates a rudimentary fort at Savage's old fields. A farmer there named Savage. He had a building and a barn, and he had fences and so forth. They tore down the fences. They created breastworks real quick. They threw up dirt ramparts. And they made a defensive stand there at 96. Surrounded by 1,400 to 1,900 Loyalists. Samuel Hammond, who was a supporter of the Patriot forces at the attack on Fort Charlotte, now he's with the Loyalist forces that's besieging Andrew Williamson. And this is the first siege of 96, and it lasted for November 19th through November 21st, 1775. From that grand 3-story brick building, there was a fella in the attic up there, a sharpshooter. His name was David Fanning. And you're going to hear a good bit about David Fanning. David Fanning lived at the confluence of Raven Creek and the Reedy River, right here in the Lawrence district. David Fanning was the fightingest man Lawrence district ever produced. David Fanning was a Tory. He was up in the attic of the jail, and he was firing at Williamson's forces. So there was one casualty at this first siege of 96, a fellow named James Birmingham. Maybe David Fanning is the one who killed him. We don't know. James Birmingham was buried where he was shot. His grave today, you can see it when you go visit 96. You can see where the jail was at 96. And David Fanning had a very intimate relationship with that jail. He was arrested 4 times and thrown in there. The first time he was in there, he went on trial for treason. And he was there a month or 2 before they had the trial. So they had the trial, and it was a jury of his peers. Half of Lawrence district was Loyalist. Half was Patriot. This was a true civil war. And the jury that was trying David Fanning for treason was packed with Loyalists. So he was found innocent. And that particular time, he was escorted out to jail. And he went to his cabin. He was 19 years old, by the way. He went to his cabin at Raven Creek and Reedy River and, spent the night there. The next day, the jailer rides up with 3 of his cohorts. And Fanning's like, "What are you doing here?" And the jailer looked at him and said, "Hey, you owe me rent." And he arrested him again. And he took him to jail, and one of David Fanning's friends paid the rent and got him out. And I'll tell you more and more about David Fanning as this lecture series presents. But he finally wound up as a Loyalist or Tory colonel in North Carolina, manning a 600-man regiment. He captured the governor of North Carolina and took him to Wilmington, fighting the whole way. I mean, there's story after story about David Fanning. He escaped captivity 14 times. Houdini had nothing on this guy. He escaped from the 96 jail 3 times. This is after he's found innocent. Saws through the bars twice. The 3rd time, he goes out through the chimney. But that's David Fanning now. He's quite a character. So we've got the first siege of 96 going on. David Fanning in the jail, shooting at Colonel Williamson. They're surrounded. The main flaw of any defense of 96 was lack of water. Now, 5 years later, we have the second siege of 96, and that was a 28-day siege with the Patriots besieging the Loyalists. But the lack of water was a huge factor there. It's hot when this first siege is going on. Again, there's no water. So the Loyalist forces know that there is a Patriot army coming to rescue Williamson. Williamson doesn't know that, but the Loyalists know that. The Council of Safety, knowing that all of this was going on in the backcountry, knowing that a force of 1,400 to 1,900 men, Loyalist militia, was raised, this was very alarming. So they they lined up Colonel Richard Richardson from Camden to bring the Camden militia and militia from North Carolina under Lieutenant Polk. They were mounted, 700 North Carolinians, about 3,000 South Carolinians. They gathered a force of 4,000 men to break the siege at 96. And the people in 96 didn't know they were coming, but all of a sudden the Loyalists were real interested in making a truce. So they made a truce that said that the Patriots would dismantle their fort and the Loyalist forces would go north of the Saluda River, and everybody in the whole United States would abide by this treaty. It was binding on everybody. And so they kind of, made that nice and broke up. Well, Colonel Richardson, as he's coming towards 96, he finds out about the treaty, he finds out about the terms of the treaty, and he's like, I didn't agree to that. And so he starts rounding up the Loyalist leaders. And this was probably the most important thing that the Patriot government could possibly have done during that time. They ran Moses Kirkland out of the country. He went up north. Moses Kirkland became a British provincial soldier. He was trained by the British to be a fighter in their army, and many other Americans were as well. Trained British men were referred to as provincials, and they also had their militia, which was not trained nearly as much. And he was also very influential in telling Clinton and the other British leaders that there was huge Loyalist sentiment in South Carolina. And he was one of the proponents of the Southern strategy later in the war that got the British forces into Charleston in 1780. Also amongst those leaders, Loyalist leaders, was Richard Paris, very influential. He was a captain in the French and Indian War. He was George Washington's ally. He helped capture Fort Duquesne from the French. He was the first European to live, recognized European to live in Greenville County. He had a plantation at the end of the Liberty Bridge in Greenville. Everybody knows the Liberty Bridge in Greenville. On the east end, the end opposite from Main Street, right there is where Richard Paris had his plantation. He had arranged a deal where he got 12 square miles of Indian territory, but he had a plantation house there, he had a grist mill, he had a sawmill, he had a whiskey still, he had a fort, he had a store, he had it going on. And he was trading with the Indians, which is very lucrative trade. And he was a British ally, and he was a Cherokee ally. And he got arrested by this force of Richard Richardson. Second in command under Richard Richardson was William Danger Thompson. And so they kind of coalesced here in Lawrence County. In the meantime, Patrick Cunningham, who had stolen the shot and powder from Mine Creek, he was involved in the first siege of 96. He still got his shot and powder. So he sees 4,000 men, approaching him. What does he do? He goes to the wildest, most secluded spot he could think of, which was in the middle of the Canebrake on the banks of the Reedy River. Now, Canebrakes were defensive stands for Cherokees for hundreds of years. When you were in the middle of a canebrake, and this is river cane, this is American bamboo, all of the bottomlands in the southeastern rivers were covered in river cane. River cane was the dominant plant. And the Indians used river cane for dozens of different reasons. They built their houses out of river cane. Baskets, they made blowguns out of it, they made spears out of it. Just one use after another. They made flutes out of it. So Patrick Cunningham is in the middle of a canebrake. And you cannot sneak up on anybody in a canebrake. The rustling leaves make way too much noise. It's like a freight train coming in. So that was a secure place for them. Now this is December of 1775. Richard Richardson has a 4,000-man army at Hollingsworth Mill, which is where Dirty Creek comes into Raven Creek. It's where Ecom Beach Road intersects with Fort Lindley Road. There was a 4,000-man army there at that mill. That's the largest army, that's the largest group of armed men that have ever been in South Carolina this side of Columbia. And this was in December of 1775. So Richard Richardson gets word that Patrick Cunningham is at the Canebrake. And he sends a flying column of 1,300 men led by Danger Thompson to the Canebrake. It's they have 650 horses, 1,300 men. I don't know if they rode double or took turns or just what they did. But they traveled that 25 miles in bitter cold along the banks of the Wild Reedy River overnight. And the next morning at dawn, they start hearing the cane burning that the Patrick Cunningham and his men had in the, they were burning it for warmth. And when river cane burns, it pops, it explodes. It sounds like a battle is going on. And this helped cover the approach of William Thompson. And it also told the Patriots exactly where Patrick Cunningham and his Loyalists were encamped. So they start to surround Cunningham and his men. Cunningham has 200 men. Thompson has 1,300. Right before the encirclement was complete, the sentries realized what was going on. They started warning shots, and shots got fired back and forth. There were 3 or 4 Loyalists killed. There was one Patriot wounded. It was Lieutenant Polk from North Carolina, a 17-year-old lieutenant who was wounded in the shoulder. He was related somehow to President William Polk. When Patrick Cunningham realized that he was under attack, he jumped out of his tent. He jumped onto his horse bareback. And some say bare breeches as well. And he skedaddled. He yelled out, "Shift for yourself." And 70 of his men escaped into the wilds of Cherokee territory. 130 of his men were captured. David Fanning was with that group, 19-year-old sergeant. He got away. James Robinson, who was actually, he was senior in command of Patrick Cunningham, but Patrick Cunningham gets all the credit, but James Robinson got away. James Lindley was captured. James Lindley was a justice of the peace in the 96th district. Patrick Cunningham was a justice of the peace. Robert Cunningham was a justice of the peace. These are British officials, and they were Loyalists. And James Lindley, we're going to talk about extensively next lecture, because he was the owner of his land is where Lindley's Fort was. James Lindley was given 200 acres as part of his pay or whatever for being justice of the peace. And there was an old fort on his property that was fortified again during the Revolutionary War. And it was taken over by the Patriot militia here in the 96th district, in Lawrence, Little River District is what it was called at that time. And James Lindley was captured. As soon as the battle was over, the 130 men who were captured, they had their hands tied behind their back. As soon as that occurred, this was just a 15-minute battle. It was more of a skirmish than anything else. As soon as the prisoners were secured, the snow started to fall. And it snowed for the next 30 hours. It snowed like the backcountry of South Carolina has really not seen since. The snow was 2 feet deep. And these men were not prepared for that. Many of them were wearing summer clothes. They were marched to Charleston. It was a 2-week march through the snow. There were bloody footprints in the snow as this occurred. But there were many of the future Patriot leaders were at the Battle of the Canebrake. Thomas Sumter was the adjutant to William Richardson. Now, he probably stayed at Hollingsworth Mill. Andrew Pickens was part of this force. John Thomas Sr., Thomas Neal, the colonel of the new acquisition. John Thomas Sr. was the colonel of the Spartan Regiment. All influential men later on. William Chronicle, he was a 17-year-old infantryman there. He was later killed at Kings Mountain. But in addition to these folks who were there, there was a Patriot militiaman named William Cunningham. William Cunningham was fighting as a Patriot against his cousin, Patrick Cunningham, who was the Loyalist leader. You may best know William Cunningham by the name of Bloody Bill Cunningham, because later in the war, he switched sides and he became the most psychopathic murderer of anyone in the Revolutionary War. But at the Battle of the Canebrake, December 22nd, 1775, William Cunningham was a patriot fighting against his cousin. So that's the Battle of the Canebrake, and that's actually the snow campaign. Now, some people say the snow campaign started when the snow started to fall. Others say the snow campaign started, with the first siege of 96, and that it was like a 6-week campaign versus a 2-week campaign. But the snow campaign was very influential because it established peace in the backcountry between the Loyalists and the Patriot forces. Now, notice, it did not establish peace with the Cherokees. This was the next big issue. But for 5 years, until the British took Charleston, the Loyalists were run out of the country. Many of them, hundreds of them, went into Cherokee territory. They went to Richard Parris's plantation. When Patrick Cunningham and David Fanning left the Battle of the Canebrake, well, they went to the Reedy River Falls, and they looked at all the skyscrapers in Greens. But that's where they were. And, they gradually just dissipated, throughout the Cherokee territory. Many of them took Cherokee wives at the time. James Lindley, he was released from Charleston in April, signed a parole. All of these prisoners were released based on them signing the parole that they would never fight again. Well, James Lindley couldn't go back to his home because Jonathan Downs has occupied it with these Little River militia. So James Lindley goes up into Cherokee territory with all the rest of them. Many of these folks went down to Florida, and some of them, like I say, went up north to fight with the British forces there. But the snow campaign established peace in the backcountry between the Loyalists and the Patriots. And the next big issue was the fight with the Cherokees, which began in June and July of 1776. So that's the end of 1775, which was the period that I wanted to cover tonight. Does anybody have any questions? Because I'll be happy to answer questions. Well, if no questions, yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
After they left the Canebrake with 130 prisoners,
Yeah.
I hear they went to the Erie River and then down the Erie River. Is that true?
Well, they probably took the Cherokee path. I'm not sure if they went down the Erie River or not, because that route you would have to cross several other rivers as well. The Cherokee path was south of the Saluda River. And then, you know, Congaree and Wateree and so forth, until they got to the Santee River. But that entire route, which the Cherokees took from Kiwi to 96 down to Charleston, was a route that you could go without crossing any major rivers. So that was what the Cherokee path was. Yes. Vanna White has sorry.
Yeah, you said Old Fort and Fort Lindley, and I've heard Old Fort called Helen's Fort. Have you ever had a name or who owned the property when it was Old Fort?
I'm not familiar with Helms Fort. I do know that Old Fort is listed on the Kaiser Helms map. And that was the map that Roy Christie used to identify where Fort Lindley was. See, for 200 years, Fort Lindley was lost to history. We did not know where it was until Hickory Tavern historian Roy Christie, he was here last month. He researched from the Kaiser Helms map. When he saw the word Old Fort and he looked where he lived, he's like, man, that's real close to my house. And for several years, he spent trying to find where Fort Lindley was. And as soon as he found it, there's no question about it. Now, we're going to tour Fort Lindley. Actually, that's our next tour after we go through Spartanburg County. I've done quite a bit of work at Fort Lindley. I'm kind of proud of what's been happening at Fort Lindley. You can still see the defensive trenches that were dug over 250 years ago. Now, those trenches at that time were probably 6 feet deep and 10 feet wide. And today, they're like 1 foot deep and 2 feet wide. But it's clearly identifiable where they were. And there's other features of that fort as well. And Fort Lindley is quite a Lawrence County story, and it's something that all of you should be proud of.